Di, leaving you at the altar back then was the absolute best decision of my life. You are just a gray, penniless nobody. Accept it. 7 years ago, this man destroyed my life by running away on our wedding day with my best friend. And today, he stood at our alumni reunion, taking sadistic pleasure in crushing me in front of our entire graduating class, while his newlywed wife bragged about their millions. I was utterly broken. I was already prepared to drop my glass, flee, and lock myself away at home forever, when suddenly, the massive oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a crash. My name is Diana Gray. In September 2018, I felt as though I had cracked the code to life. I was 25 years old, and if someone had asked me to describe my existence in a single word, I would have answered without hesitation: flawless. My mornings began with a jog through the shaded alleys of the suburbs. There wasn't a single chaotic spot in my schedule, and ahead of me loomed a future written in gold ink on the expensive, matte paper of wedding invitations. I was getting ready to marry Adrian Harris. We met during our sophomore year of university on a rainy October afternoon in the student library. I was frantically trying to make sense of macroeconomic graphs when he simply sat across from me, gently slid his cup of hot coffee toward me, and said, "If you frown any harder, those supply and demand curves are going to completely surrender to your beauty." It was cliché, maybe even a bit too cheesy, but Adrian possessed a stunning, almost hypnotic superpower. He masterfully knew how to tell people exactly what they desperately wanted to hear at that specific moment. He wasn't the kind of guy who knocked you off your feet with sheer brutality or loud wealth. No, Adrian conquered space gradually, like a soft, creeping fog. He was a chameleon of the highest order. When I first brought him to my parents' house, I was incredibly nervous. My father, Richard Gray, was a stern man of the old school who had spent his entire life working in logistics and despised empty talkers. I expected a cross-examination, but within 40 minutes, Adrian was leaning back in the armchair of my father's office, enthusiastically discussing futures, port terminal development strategies, and new tax reforms. My father looked at him with a rare expression of approval. "That boy has a backbone, Dee," my father told me that evening, taking off his glasses. "He thinks 3 steps ahead, a rare quality in today's youth." With my mother, Adrian played an entirely different card. He didn't talk to her about business. Instead, he admired her garden, asked about the intricacies of baking the perfect cinnamon apple pie, and listened with reverence to stories from her youth. He made my mother feel like the wisest, most charming woman in the world. He paid my friends compliments that were so subtle, unobtrusive, and tasteful that they literally melted, enviously whispering in my ear, "Dee, where did you dig up this prince? People like him just don't exist." Back then, in my naive 25-year-old mind, I considered this a rare gift of diplomacy, incredible emotional maturity, and deep empathy. It seemed to me that Adrian was the most reliable person on the planet, my personal safe harbor who understood the structure of the human soul. If anyone had told me then that all this empathy was merely the result of cold, sterile calculation, a mask behind which hid a pathological egoist and manipulator, I would have laughed in their face. Adrian didn't emphasize with people, he simply studied their weaknesses, the way an entomologist studies butterflies, only to later pierce them with a pin in the exact right spot. The preparations for our wedding took over a year. We approached the matter with a frightening level of perfectionism. We booked the ancient, Gothic St. Jude's Church, a place steeped in a century of history where the wrought iron gates were overgrown with ivy and the inside smelled of wax and eternity. You had to join the waiting list and pay 14 months before the intended date. My parents, blinded by happiness for their only daughter, completely covered the expenses for renting the country estate for the reception, a massive property with cascading fountains, manicured English lawns, and ancient oak trees. I found the dress. It was heavy, flowing silk in an unbleached linen hue, with the finest silver hand embroidery along the bodice, and an endless, majestic train that was meant to trail behind me down the church aisle. Every fitting felt like a sacred ritual. My best friend Giselle volunteered to help me with all the organizational matters. We had been inseparable since the first grade. We shared the same desk, hid cheat sheets for each other, cried into our pillows at night over our first heartbreaks, and swore at the age of 12 that we would be each other's maids of honor. Giselle was vibrant, emotional, and sometimes overly eccentric, but I chalked her sharp mood swings up to her artistic nature. During the final month before the wedding, Giselle practically lived at our house. She took on a colossal volume of work, coordinating the catering, arguing with florists over the exact shade of hydrangeas, double-checking the guest seating charts. She was everywhere. She had breakfast with me, drank coffee with Adrian, and discussed the menu with my mother. I was so grateful to her, so blind in my pre-wedding euphoria, that I was ready to worship her devotion. The day before the ceremony, we were sitting on the rug in my living room. The room was cluttered with boxes of silk ribbons, thick cardstock invitations, and crystal candle holders. We needed to arrange the last name cards on the tables according to the final seating plan. My back was aching terribly, my fingers were stained with gold ink, but I was smiling with an absolute, ringing anticipation of happiness. I took the card with Adrian's name, carefully wrote out his last name, Harris, and said softly, holding my breath, "Giselle, can you imagine? I still can't believe that tomorrow all of this is actually happening. Tomorrow I'll be Mrs. Harris. Everything feels like some incredible, prolonged dream. I'm almost afraid to wake up." At that moment, Giselle was holding the card with her own name. She looked at me in a very strange, somewhat detached way. For a second, her gaze turned heavy, almost glassy. She slowly reached out, traced the tip of her fingernail over the fresh gold letters on Adrian's card, as if erasing them, and answered quietly, almost in a whisper, "Yes, Dee, life is an unpredictable thing. Sometimes dreams end too abruptly, so abruptly that you don't even have time to understand where reality is." Back then, I didn't attach any meaning to her strange tone. I assumed she was simply exhausted by the endless rush, or perhaps her own loneliness was speaking. Giselle hadn't dated anyone in over a year and a half, and all her attempts to start a serious relationship had ended in failure. I mentally promised myself that right after the honeymoon, I would definitely look out for my friend's personal life and introduce her to one of Adrian's colleagues. If only I had known what a sinister, bone-chilling irony lay hidden behind her quiet whisper on that rug. The morning of September 22nd began perfectly. A soft, unseasonably warm sun was shining, painting the walls of the hotel suite where I was getting ready in gentle, golden tones. It was a luxurious Victorian-style suite with massive panoramic windows. By 7 in the morning, the stylist and makeup artist had arrived. The usual pre-wedding chaos whirled through the air. It smelled of hairspray, expensive powder, fresh-cut roses, and splashes of champagne that my bridesmaids were pouring into flutes. The girls laughed, tried on their pastel pink dresses, opened shoeboxes, and endlessly took photos for social media. The atmosphere was soaked in pure, concentrated celebration. The only thing that pricked my confidence like a light needle was that Adrian wasn't replying to my messages. At 8 o'clock in the morning, barely suppressing a smile, I wrote to him, "Good morning, my almost husband. Waiting for you at the church. Please don't mix up the tie." The message remained hanging with a delivered status, but no reply followed. At 9 in the morning, I tried to call. The long, rhythmic rings in the receiver felt endless. No one picked up. At 10 o'clock, Adrian's phone went out of network coverage entirely. A mechanical operator's voice dryly announced that the subscriber was unavailable. My friends, noticing that I was glancing at the screen more and more frequently, began to reassure me. Audrey, an old university friend, walked up to me with a laugh, handing me a mimosa. "Dee, what are you freezing up for? Relax. This is a classic, the runaway bridegroom syndrome from Hollywood melodramas. Guys always panic before the altar. It's on a genetic level for them." His friends probably overdid it with the whiskey at the bachelor party last night, and right now he's frantically trying to remember where his cufflinks are and washing off the remnants of a hangover with ice water. You'll see, he'll arrive a little late, but dressed to the nines. The girls burst into laughter, catching on to the joke. I forced myself to smile too, letting out a short chuckle, though inside me, somewhere around the solar plexus, a sticky, chilling sense of dread had already begun to grow. It felt like a fine tremor. My heart beat hollowly and heavily in my chest, making it difficult to take a deep breath. Time was moving relentlessly toward noon. Our departure for the church was strictly set for 12:30. The timing was scheduled down to the minute, as another wedding was set to take place at St. Jude's Church right after ours. The hairstylist had already pinned the last bobby pins into my intricate updo, and carefully, barely breathing, secured the long, sheer veil. I sat in a white silk bridal robe in front of a massive mirror in a gilded frame, staring at my pale face. Makeup couldn't entirely hide how sharp my features had become from the mounting terror. Giselle wasn't in the room. She had left for the church back at 10 in the morning. Before leaving, she quickly kissed me on the cheek, leaving a lipstick mark on my skin, and said she needed to personally check the readiness of the altar, supervise the installation of the floral arches, and meet the florists. At least, that was how she argued her early departure. At 11:37, my phone, which was lying on the polished vanity table next to a bottle of my wedding perfume, buzzed sharply and intensely. The sound of the vibration felt like a thunderclap out of the blue. The name flashed on the screen. Adrian. Frantically breaking a nail, I grabbed the phone, almost knocking over the perfume bottle, and opened the message. My eyes raced across the screen, trying to catch paragraphs of text with explanations. But there were no paragraphs. On the white background, only 6 words glowed. 6 short, sterile words. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." And that was it. Nothing else. Not a single punctuation mark at the end. No explanations. No incoming call. Just a dry, lifeless text that, in a single millisecond, turned my entire future, all my dreams, and my whole life into a gigantic, smoking pile of ash. I slowly rose from the chair, feeling my legs literally give out beneath me. My knees turned to water, unable to hold my body weight. The phone screen continued to glow with a dead blue light, and the black letters began to blur and double before my eyes. My friends, who had been cheerfully discussing the bouquets until then, instantly noticed how my face had changed. My skin took on an earthy gray tint. The music in the room, a light jazz, abruptly died, as if someone had ripped out the cords. "Dee? What's wrong? Did Adrian turn up? What is he writing?" Audrey asked, taking a cautious step toward me and reaching out her hand. I couldn't utter a single word. My lips were physically numb, like after a strong shot of anesthesia at the dentist, and the air was trapped somewhere in my throat, burning my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I simply handed Audrey the phone with a trembling hand, my fingers shaking violently. Audrey took the smartphone, quickly scanned the line of text, and her face stretched in genuine horror. She covered her mouth with her palm. A ringing, deathly, almost palpable silence hung over the room, broken only by the distant hum of the city streets outside the window. My brain, caught off guard by this monstrous psychological trauma, flatly refused to believe what was happening. Primitive defense mechanisms kicked in. The human mind is designed so that in the first minutes of a catastrophe, it clings to any excuse, no matter how foolish, absurd, or fantastical, just to avoid admitting the terrible truth. "He was kidnapped," flashed through my mind. "He's being blackmailed. His phone was hacked by ill-wishers or his father's competitors. This is a stupid, cruel prank by his groomsmen who decided to test my resolve before the altar." I began to press the call button without stopping, with a maniacal persistence. Time after time, over and over. The phone at my ear, and that cursed, mechanical, pre-recorded operator's voice. "The subscriber is temporarily unavailable. Please call back later." That voice ate into my subconscious, driving me insane. I ended the call and dialed Giselle's number. After all, she was supposed to be at the church. She must have seen whether his motorcade had arrived, what his relatives were saying, what the atmosphere was like at the altar. But my best friend's phone gave me the exact same memorized phrase. Unavailable. It was as if they had both vanished from the face of the earth, falling into a black hole. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door of the hotel suite burst open with a crash, nearly slamming against the wall. My cousin Karen practically flew inside. She was supposed to arrive at the church on her own, but for some reason, she was here. She was pale, breathless, as if she had run up several flights of stairs. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes were wide with shock, and she held her smartphone in her hands with a death grip. Karen rushed across the room straight toward me, unceremoniously pushing aside the frozen bridesmaids. "Dee! My God, Dee, you have to see this! You have to look at this right now!" Karen gasped out in a broken voice, thrusting her phone screen almost flat against my face. "My friend Mark just sent me this. He works at the gas station, at the exit of the city, near the Southern Highway." I forced my gaze to focus on the screen. It was a photograph taken on a mobile phone camera, apparently through the windshield of another car. The quality was grainy, but the lighting was bright. The timestamp in the corner of the frame showed 11:05, just 32 minutes ago. In the picture, next to a gas pump, stood Adrian's large, recognizable black SUV. The trunk door was popped open, and through the glass, it was clearly visible that the entire interior of the vehicle was packed to the absolute top with large travel suitcases and bags. The exact same suitcases we had bought for our honeymoon in Italy. In the foreground, right by the open passenger door, stood Adrian himself. He wasn't wearing his wedding tuxedo. He was dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and old jeans, and right next to him, locked in his space, with her arms wrapped around his neck and her entire body pressing into his, stood Giselle. She was wearing large sunglasses that hid half her face, but it was absolutely 100% irrefutably her. Her haircut, her figure, her signature bracelet on her wrist that I had given her myself for her birthday. Adrian was kissing her on the lips, tenderly, passionately, with a sort of possessive infatuation, while the automatic pump filled the tank of his car. They didn't look scared or confused. On the contrary, their posture radiated the wild, adrenaline-fueled euphoria of fugitives who had committed the perfect crime. They were leaving together, my fiancé and my best friend, on my wedding day. An hour before I was supposed to put on the ring. In that same second, my brain seemed to shut down. A fuse blew to protect me from the unbearable mental pain. I don't remember how a terrifying, primal cry, more like the howl of a wounded beast, tore from my chest. I don't remember how I collapsed to my knees straight onto the expensive carpet of the hotel room. My fingers frantically clawed at the silk of my own dress and veil, and I began to rip the finest, expensive fabric apart with sheer force, tearing my nails until they bled. The subsequent events of that day were preserved in my memory only as scattered, jagged, painful flashes. A minute later, my mother walks into the room. Her face instantly goes white. She drops her handbag, and her lipstick rolls out with a soft thud. Then my father appears. His jaws are tightly clenched, purple veins bulge on his forehead. He takes Karen's phone, stares into the picture, and for the first time in my life, I see his hands begin to tremble with a helpless, suffocating fury. Then my friends scramble around. Someone shoves a cotton ball with a sharp smell of ammonia under my nose. Someone tries to pour sedative drops that smell of mint and valerian into a glass. I had been betrayed by the two closest people in the entire universe. They didn't just leave. They planned this departure in a way that would deal a colossal, crushing blow to my pride, my love, my reputation, and my psyche. They crushed me publicly, right in front of 150 guests who, at that very moment, were already arriving at St. Jude's Church with bouquets of flowers. But back then, lying on the floor in a torn veil, I didn't yet know that this nightmare of a day was by no means the finale. It was only the very beginning of my long, excruciating, and dark path to the absolute bottom of human despair. The next few months merged for me into one endless, sticky, gray blur of unbearable nightmare. The wedding, naturally, was canceled as an emergency. My father took on the heavy mission of going to the church and turning back the guests who had already managed to arrive. But the scale of the catastrophe was too massive to be hidden or hushed up. It wasn't enough to just lie on the bed in my room with the curtains drawn, staring at the ceiling and crying softly from the suffocating emptiness inside. I had to face the cruel, humiliating, dry, technical reality of this collapse head-on. Instead of enjoying the warm sun of the Amalfi Coast and drinking wine on a terrace for my honeymoon, I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by printed guest lists. My parents wanted to hire someone or take this duty upon themselves, but I stubbornly, with a kind of masochistic persistence, refused. I realized that I had to drink this cup to the very dregs. I personally, with my own hands, called each of the 150 people invited to the celebration. My voice changed over those days. It became dry, mechanical, devoid of any inflection, resembling the voice of a robotic answering machine. "Hello, Aunt Mary. This is Diana. Yes, thank you, I'm fine. I'm calling to say that the wedding on September 22nd has been canceled due to personal circumstances. No, it won't be rescheduled. There won't be a celebration at all. Yes, Adrian and I are no longer together. Thank you for understanding. Please, no questions. All the best." Every such call was like a lash of a whip against an open, bleeding wound. People reacted differently. Distant relatives gasped, covered their mouths, began frantically asking for details, and tried to express their cliché, suffocating condolences that made me want to howl. Former university friends awkwardly filled the silences, not knowing what to say, while the gossips, I could literally feel it through miles of telephone wires, gleefully rubbed their hands together, anticipating how they would discuss this juicy drama over dinner. By the end of the week, I had calluses on my fingers from the smartphone, and everything inside me was burned down to a state of absolute, sterile desert. But the most disgusting, filthy, and grounded moment was dealing with the numerous wedding vendors. Since Adrian and Giselle had simply vanished, turning off their phones and deleting their profiles, all the financial, legal, and organizational problems fell as a dead weight onto my shoulders. Most agencies, the florists, the decorators, the limo rentals, treated my situation with pure human understanding. They returned part of the deposit, didn't demand a cancellation fee, and quietly closed the contracts. But the elite city pastry shop La Cerise, where we had ordered our grand, ostentatious wedding cake, flatly refused to return our colossal deposit. The amount was substantial. The four-tiered culinary masterpiece with lavender cream, hand-molded fondant, and edible flowers imported from France cost as much as a used car. The senior manager of the pastry shop, a woman with a manicured face and an icy voice, declared to me over the phone, "Look, Miss Gray, the contract is drawn up in your name. The cake is already fully prepared. The premium class ingredients have been purchased, and our head pastry chef worked on your lavender tower all night without sleep. It is exclusively your personal problem that your fiancé changed his mind at the last moment. We incurred production expenses. According to Clause 4.2 of our contract, if canceled less than 48 hours in advance, the deposit is forfeited. Either you come and pick up the cake by 5 this evening, or we will dispose of it. No one is going to return your money." This was the final straw. At that moment, for the first time in weeks, a hollow, furious, dark resentment against this entire world broke through the wall of my tears. The day after the aborted wedding, I got out of bed. I forced myself to wash my hair, put on huge, solid black sunglasses to hide my swollen eyes, red from endless crying, took my car keys, and drove to that cursed pastry shop. When the staff of La Cerise wheeled that massive, mockingly beautiful, flawlessly white four-tiered cake into the hall on a special cart, giving off a gentle scent of natural vanilla and lavender, it took my breath away. It was perfection. It was the physical embodiment of the fairy tale I had believed in. The pastry chef had truly outdone himself. With the help of 2 sympathetic movers, we somehow managed to place the gigantic box on the back seat of my car. I sat behind the wheel, started the engine, and at first I had a wild, maniacal urge to speed up and slam into a concrete wall at full speed, so that this cake would shatter into a million dirty pieces along with me. I wanted to destroy this beauty that stung my eyes so painfully. Instead, I shifted into gear and drove to a completely different part of town, toward the Central Railway station. It was a bleak, dirty, eternally bustling place that smelled of cheap fast food, creosote, and despair. It was where those whom life had thrown to the margins always gathered: the homeless, the vagrants, lost people in soiled jackets. I parked the car right by the main entrance, in plain view of everyone. I stepped out of the cabin, opened the back door, and removed the top of the cardboard box. I pulled a plastic knife from the glove compartment, left over from some old picnic. I began to slice this luxurious, elite wedding cake into huge, messy pieces. "Hey, come over here! Have some cake! It's absolutely free! Take as much as you want!" I shouted loudly, with a certain strain, into the crowd of passers-by. At first, people were startled. They walked around me, taking me for a madwoman. But gradually, a crowd began to gather around the car. Two homeless men in greasy coats were the first to approach. Their hands trembled as I handed them slices of delicate lavender sponge cake on cardboard trays. Then street vendors, gypsies, and random, exhausted passengers with old suitcases joined in. I stood in the piercing autumn wind, tears streaming in large drops from under my black sunglasses, smudging my makeup and staining my face, while the people around me ate this exquisite masterpiece of confectionery art straight with their hands. They got smeared with cream, smiled, thanked me, nodded their heads, and wished me health and happiness, without having the slightest clue that right there, before their very eyes, they were eating the wake for my ruined, trampled, and destroyed life. With every slice handed out, it felt as though I was physically tearing away pieces of my former naivety. When the box was empty, leaving only smeared purple cream at the bottom, I threw the plastic knife into a trash can, got into the car, and burst into tears, crying harder than I had even on the wedding day itself. This was a final goodbye. To keep from completely losing my mind from the ringing, suffocating, vacuum-like emptiness within the four walls of my parents' house, I urgently, immediately, needed to occupy my hands, eyes, and brain with something. My psyche demanded a harsh detox. As strange, paradoxical, and ironic as it looked from the outside, I decided to immerse myself completely, without reservation, into the very sphere that had so cruelly destroyed me. I went into event planning. I registered a small, modest agency. I had no starting capital other than my own small savings. At first, these were the most basic, low-paying gigs: children's birthdays with animators in superhero costumes, modest anniversaries in neighborhood cafes, organizing small high school graduations. But I worked like someone possessed, like a crazed robot. I deliberately overloaded my schedule so that I would return to my rented apartment at 2 in the morning and simply fall onto the bed in my clothes, passing out without a single thought in my head. If I had any free time, memories of Adrian and Giselle would instantly invade my brain, so I annihilated that time with work. I worked 18 hours a day, with no days off, no vacations, and no right to a breather. In parallel, I began going to intense, grueling, deep therapy sessions with a psychotherapist. These were sessions full of tears, screams, and pulling out the rotten shards that the traitors had left inside me. Bit by bit, we pieced my trampled self-esteem back together. I made a radical decision to cut off all loose ends. Our half-built suburban house with Adrian, where we had already managed to choose the tiles for the kitchen and the wall color for the bedroom, I sold without a shadow of regret, accepting the very first price the buyers offered. Being there was physically, somatically painful. Every corner, every doorway reminded me of plans that were never meant to come true. I packed 2 suitcases with my things, loaded them into the car, and moved to the other side of the state, to a small provincial town where nobody knew me. I completely changed my phone number that very day. I deleted every single one of my old social media accounts. I cut off contact with all mutual acquaintances, classmates, and even with certain relatives who loved to gossip. I built a deaf, thick, impenetrable wall around myself, carefully avoiding any places, cities, companies, or memories where I could even theoretically meet or hear a mention of Adrian or Giselle. I started life with an absolutely clean, sterile slate. Years of working in a state of burnout did not go to waste. My tiny agency, which I had once opened on sheer stubbornness and the remnants of my savings, was slowly but surely turning into a serious player in the market. By 2024, we had completely outgrown the level of children's matinees and family anniversaries. Now, my company handled the comprehensive management of large-scale IT conferences, international medical symposiums, and private corporate events for the top management of major corporations. I learned to be tough. The soft, naive romantic who had cried over a lavender cake in 2018 was dead. In her place emerged Diana Gray, a woman with an impeccable business reputation, icy calmness in crisis situations, and a sharp, analytical mind. I could find a replacement for a sick speaker from another country 2 hours before a forum started, renegotiate a contract with a subcontractor in the middle of the night, and force a crew of technicians to assemble a complex stage twice as fast as the norm. My personal life, meanwhile, remained behind tightly closed shutters. I had learned to sleep without nightmares in which Adrian leaves me at the altar, and I no longer flinched at the sound of incoming notifications. But I deliberately chose not to let men get any closer to me than the distance of a brief business dinner. The scar on my heart had healed into thick, insensitive tissue, but I remembered perfectly well how easily that scar could start bleeding again if I let go of control. And then, in early 2026, when nearly 8 years had passed since that catastrophe, an email marked "Important" arrived in my new corporate inbox. I was sitting in my spacious, bright office, lazily sipping cooled coffee and reviewing the schedules for the week. Clicking on the notification, I froze. It was an official, expensively and exquisitely designed interactive invitation to a grand alumni evening at our academy. Dear Diana Gray, we invite you to the grand celebration of the 30th anniversary since the founding of our academy campus, the class of 2018. The laptop screen flickered mockingly. Inside me, in the deepest and darkest recesses of my memory, an old, sticky, almost forgotten fear stirred. My breath caught for a second. Our graduating class. That meant everyone would be there. After all, I hadn't been living in a total information vacuum. No matter how carefully I cut off old ties, scraps of rumors from my past life occasionally reached me through third hands. I knew that Adrian and Giselle had married about a year after their shameful escape. They hadn't settled for anything modest. They threw a lavish, ostentatious wedding using the money of Giselle's father, who owned a major construction firm in our home state. On social media, as my cousin Karen had told me once, they maintained a joint page where they actively, with maniacal persistence, constructed the image of an influential, ideal, and flawlessly wealthy couple. Photographs against the backdrop of rented yachts, pretentious dinners at 3-star Michelin restaurants, endless designer items, and captions like, "Blessed to be together." I hesitated for 3 long weeks. Every night I would wake up, lie on my back, and stare at the reflections of the streetlights on the ceiling, weighing all the pros and cons. My few friends from my new life, upon learning about this invitation, unanimously tried to dissuade me. "Diana, why do you need this? It's just extra stress, pure masochism. You've built a great life, you have a successful business. Why go back to the place where you were so brutally hurt? Let them stew in their own juice." But at some point, toward the end of the 3rd week, a hollow, heavy, and furious anger awoke in me instead of the usual anxiety. I sat before the mirror and looked at my reflection. Were those two still, after all these years, controlling my actions with their invisible presence? Was I going to hide in my shell, miss important professional meetings, and refuse to communicate with the people with whom I had spent my best university years, just because I was afraid to see the faces of 2 liars? I realized that if I didn't go there, it would mean their definitive, absolute victory. It would be an admission that they had broken me back in 2018, permanently depriving me of my freedom of choice. The anger completely displaced the fear. I opened my laptop, with a decisive click, confirmed my attendance, and paid for a VIP ticket to the evening. There was no turning back. Here's the translation of the remaining chapters, chapters 7 to 13, into English, maintaining the emotional rhythm, cinematic tension, and dramatic payoff of the story. The preparations for this evening were entirely different from my wedding rush 7 years ago. There were no naive tears or romantic expectations. This was getting ready for war, where my main weapon had to be in flawless appearance. The day before my departure, I went to the most expensive, exclusive boutique in the city center. I wasn't looking for compromises. I needed a dress that projected absolute confidence, status, and an underlying threat. And I found it. It was a structured, yet incredibly sensual, floor-length sapphire dress made of thick, heavy silk. It fit my figure perfectly, like a second skin, accentuating the line of my hips and my narrow waist. The deep, noble hue of the precious gem made my green eyes appear even darker, while the off-the-shoulder neckline added an aristocratic touch to the look. To match it, I chose understated high stiletto heels and thin white gold earrings. No unnecessary tinsel, just clean lines and expensive simplicity. When that Saturday evening finally arrived, and my car pulled up to the main entrance of the five-star Grand Regent Hotel, where the alumni reunion was being held, I began to shake noticeably. My hands grew cold on the steering wheel. My heart did a heavy flip and lodged itself somewhere in my throat. I turned off the engine, closed my eyes, and took 3 deep breaths, just as my therapist had taught me. Inhale, hold, slow exhale. I reminded myself of who I was. I was no longer a victim. I was Diana Gray, the master of my own life. Crossing the threshold of the luxurious, brilliantly lit ballroom, I felt as though I had stepped into the crosshairs of hundreds of invisible cameras. Music thundered under the high, vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished parquet floor, and servers in formal attire navigated through the guests with trays laden with champagne. The room was loud and suffocating. 140 former classmates, professors, and academy alumni were embracing, laughing loudly over the music, and vying to boast about their career milestones, cars, and families. At first, I felt incredibly awkward. It seemed to me that the moment I walked in, a whisper rippled through the hall. I imagined that all these people were looking at me through the prism of that scandalous story about the runaway groom. I was already prepared to turn around and leave when suddenly, Cheryl Benson resolutely cut through the crowd toward me. She was our former class president, known during our student years for her directness, sharp tongue, and remarkably kind, just heart. Cheryl hugged me tightly, nearly cracking my ribs, stepped back, and cast an admiring gaze over my sapphire dress. "Diana, Mother of God, is that really you?" she exclaimed loudly, making no effort to hide her delight. "You look absolutely incredible, a true queen of the room. Please, keep your back straight and your chin held high. You are far stronger, more successful, and more beautiful than any of them think. I am so glad you came." Her words washed over me like a sip of ice-cold water in the middle of a desert. The panic receded. I straightened my posture, took a deep breath, and allowed Cheryl to draw me into a conversation with our old circle. Gradually, I began to relax, answer questions about my business, and even smile genuinely. But this illusion of tranquility lasted only until the hands of the clock neared 9 in the evening. About an hour into the evening, a strange, undulating stir arose near the massive main doors of the ballroom. Conversations in that part of the room began to quiet down, the music seemed to fade into the background, and all heads, as if on cue, turned toward the entrance. They walked into the hall. Adrian and Giselle. They looked as though they had stepped straight off the pages of a glossy magazine documenting the lives of a fictional elite. Adrian wore an expensive, flawlessly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair styled perfectly down to the last strand, and that same confident, velvety, hypnotic smile that had once driven me mad played across his face. He looked more mature, but there was something new in his eyes, something hard, predatory, and cynical. Giselle walked beside him, holding his arm tightly, almost frantically. She wore a dazzling white designer dress complete with a train. It was a provocative, deeply inappropriate, borderline bridal outfit for a casual alumni reunion. It was obvious that even now, 7 years later, she was still trying to prove something to the world and to herself. An expensive necklace sparkled like a massive crescent around her neck, and a large diamond ring gleamed mockingly on her left hand. She walked with her head held high, literally scanning the room with the gaze of a predator searching for its target. And of course, her eyes locked onto me almost immediately. I was standing in a circle with Cheryl, Karen, and a couple of our other former classmates. When Giselle saw me in my sapphire dress, her rehearsed, glossy smile froze on her face for a mere fraction of a second. I managed to catch that microscopic, barely perceptible flash of panic and wild discomfort in her eyes before she regained her composure and pulled back on her mask of absolute bliss. She quickly whispered something into Adrian's ear, gesturing subtly in my direction. Adrian turned his head. His eyebrows shot up in surprise for a moment, but he instantly recovered his smug demeanor. Clinking their champagne glasses, they purposefully headed straight toward our group. The crowd of alumni parted before them as if they were the masters of the universe. "Diana! What an unexpected, what a delightful surprise! I didn't expect to see you here in our neck of the woods." Adrian's painfully familiar, insinuating, velvety voice echoed beside my ear. That voice, which had once whispered words of love to me, promised eternal fidelity, and granted a sense of absolute security, now triggered nothing but a mild, cold wave of physical nausea. Nothing tore apart inside me. There was only a profound sense of disgust. I turned around slowly, maintaining an absolute, ironclad composure on my face. "Hello, Adrian. Hello, Giselle," I replied in a flat, icy tone, showing no emotion whatsoever, as if I had run into random passengers on a bus. Giselle immediately seized the initiative, cutting Adrian off before he could say another word. She contrastingly adjusted her perfect curls, flaunting her hand with the massive ring, and spoke in an unnaturally loud, sugary, piercing voice, aiming to draw the attention of as many surrounding people as possible. "Oh, Diana, darling, we are just incredibly happy that you finally stepped out into the world, crawled out of your shell. We tried so hard to find out about you through mutual acquaintances, to learn where you had vanished to, how you had settled down. Adrian and I have been just insanely happy all these years. Adrian is now the vice president at my dad's construction holding company. We recently bought a luxurious, massive home in an exclusive gated community. We have our own fleet of cars, 3 purebred dogs. In short, life is bursting at the seams. We can barely keep up with flying off to resorts." She rattled on without a pause, literally pelting those present with brand names, astronomical figures, and the names of elite destinations. It was blatant that Giselle was frantically, blindly trying to pierce my armor. It was vital for her to make me feel inadequate, poor, and like a lonely, abandoned wreck compared to their dazzling, fake triumph. The other classmates, sensing how thick the air within a 3-meter radius had become with psychological tension, began to shift awkwardly from foot to foot and look away. The celebratory atmosphere vanished instantly, transforming into a brutal mental battlefield. My cousin Karen, who was standing beside me, couldn't endure this torrent of bragging and attempted to defend me politely but firmly. And Diana, by the way, now runs her own large and highly successful agency. They organize international business forums and government events. She has serious contracts all over the country. Hearing this, Adrian merely let out a condescending, soft, and brief laugh. He looked at me with a fake, saccharine concern in his eyes that reeked of pure, concentrated venom from a mile away, and announced loudly to the entire section, "Oh, event planning? Animators, balloons, clowns, kids' cakes. That's very sweet, Diana. Really, very touching. The main thing is that you're happy in your little, cozy hustle. After all, you must agree, not everyone in this life is cut out to run a major industrial business, handle multi-million-dollar budgets, and make tough decisions, right? Some people are just built to work in the background, to service someone else's celebration of life. And that is absolutely normal. We don't judge you in the slightest." A deathly, suffocating, paralyzing silence fell over the room. This was a direct, calculated, public humiliation wrapped in the glossy packaging of pseudo-concern. I felt the hot blood rush to my cheeks, and my heart began to beat frantically and unevenly in my chest. They were trying to trample me right here, in front of everyone who had known me since childhood. I realized that if I remained standing here for even another second, I would either snap and shout back or burst into tears over this injustice, which was exactly what they so passionately, so greedily anticipated to permanently seal their status as victors. "Excuse me, I need to step away," I said in an icy, barely audible tone. I turned on my heels and walked across the ballroom toward the buffet counter near the entrance to the open terrace. I just needed to be alone for 1 minute and take a sip of ice water to steady my shaking. I stood at the buffet counter, my slender fingers gripping a glass of ice water so tightly that the glass gave an almost imperceptible creak. I stared out the window at the night city, trying to calm my breathing. Suddenly, quiet, confident, measured footsteps echoed behind my back. I turned around and saw Adrian. He had come alone, leaving Giselle in her circle of admirers. The soft, sugary mask he maintained for the public was gone from his face. Only the hard, cynical, triumphant smirk of a man confident in his total impunity remained. He approached closely, violating all boundaries of personal space, leaned down to my very ear, and quietly, with clear, sadistic relish, uttered the words meant to break my psyche once and for all. "You know, Diana, leaving you at the church altar back then and driving off with Giselle was, of course, brutally cruel, but it was hands down the best and most correct decision of my life. Look at me, and look at yourself. 7 years have passed, and you're still entirely alone, digging around in your petty, low-paying parties, living on past grievances, and hiding your eyes. You're just an empty shell, Diana. A gray, boring, empty shell compared to my wife and my status. Accept it." My heart pounded somewhere near my throat, my breath caught from this beyond bounds, inhuman cruelty. I looked into his once-beloved eyes and realized that all my years of hard work to piece myself back together could collapse right now, at this very second. I felt overwhelmed by his pressure. I was ready to drop the glass, turn around and simply flee this hotel, drive home, and lock myself away forever, conceding my total defeat in life. I had already taken the first step toward the exit when suddenly, the heavy, massive oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a crash that made the walls shudder. The people entering caused even the DJ to freeze, who instantly cut the music in surprise, plunging the hall into absolute silence. Into the hall, with a confident, firm, authoritative stride, walked a man whose appearance here was equivalent to the detonation of a tactical bomb. It was Ethan Brooks. In our city, and indeed across the entire country, this name was known to absolutely everyone who had even a passing interest in economics, finance, and big business. A young, incredibly press-shy, hard, and uncompromising venture investor, a billionaire whose face regularly graced the covers of Forbes and leading analytical chronicles. He never, as a matter of principle, attended social gatherings of this kind, let alone high school or academy reunions, to which he had no connection whatsoever. He wore an flawless dark suit, custom-tailored on Savile Row, and his cold, discerning, scanning gaze instantly evaluated the situation in the hushed room. But what shocked the public was not so much the appearance of the financial titan, but rather who was with him. Ethan Brooks did not arrive accompanied by security guards or a leggy top model. He held firmly and securely onto the hand of a little 7-year-old boy named Noah, who was dressed in an amusing, incredibly charming miniature 3-piece suit with a bow tie. The boy turned his head from side to side, curiously examining the massive hall and the frozen people, and suddenly his eyes lit up with genuine joy. He spotted me standing by the buffet table in my sapphire dress. Wrenching his small palm free from his father's hand, Noah, with a joyful, ringing childhood cry that echoed through the abruptly quieted frozen hall, ran across the entire room straight toward me. "Mom! Mom, we made it! Dad drove the car like a crazy person. He broke all the rules, but we're not late!" The child flew into my embrace at a run, wrapping his arms around my waist with all his might and burying his nose in the silk of my dress. Automatically, without hesitating for a single second, I dropped to my knees before him on the parquet floor, pulling him close, and a genuine, deep, and warm smile appeared on my face for the first time during this grueling evening. All the wild tension that had been suffocating me a moment ago under Adrian's onslaught began to rapidly recede, dissolving in the familiar scent of children's shampoo and the warmth of those small, honest arms. A collective, shocked, ragged gasp rippled through the room from the 140 people. People began to exchange glances, crane their necks, and open their mouths in astonishment. Adrian, who stood just 2 paces away from me, literally had his jaw drop, and his smug, hard smirk vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of complete, wild, foolish bewilderment. Giselle, who was watching this scene from the center of the hall, stood up on her tiptoes. Her manicured face began to turn rapidly pale and broke out in uneven, ugly red splotches of panic. Ethan Brooks walked up to us calmly, unhurriedly, measuring every step. He stopped beside us, extended a hand to help me up from my knees, and then confidently, gently, and tenderly wrapped his arm around my shoulders, drawing me to his side. He smiled warmly down at me and spoke in a deep, velvety voice, loud enough for his words to carry to the furthest tables of the ballroom. "Sorry we're late, darling. Noah had an important final soccer match at school. The game dragged on due to a penalty shootout, and we couldn't possibly leave before the official award ceremony concluded. Our champion took home the main trophy. I hope we didn't interrupt anything truly important here." I looked into his deep, calm, gray eyes, which radiated absolute support, and felt an ironclad, unshakable confidence establish itself inside me. The walls of my defense became solid once more. "No, Ethan, you arrived just in time. They were actually just discussing the scale of businesses, life achievements, and who is capable of what in this life," I replied, barely suppressing a triumphant smile as I looked at a pale Adrian. Adrian and Giselle stood as if struck by lightning. A primal, existential horror and total cognitive dissonance were readable in their eyes. For 7 long years, they had lived in the absolute, ironclad certainty that I was a broken, lonely, miserable woman licking her wounds in a tiny apartment on the outskirts, engaging in petty hustles out of despair. They had come to this alumni reunion with a single purpose: to triumphantly dance on the bones of my past with a full marching band. And suddenly, right before them, towers a man whose status, influence, political connections, and capital were so vast that the construction firm of Giselle's father seemed like a petty, insignificant train station kiosk compared to his multinational holding. Ethan knew everything about me. He knew my story from the very first to the very last word. We had met 3 years ago at a major international business conference. My agency was handling the entire technical and logistical process of that highly complex 3-day forum, and Ethan had been invited as a keynote speaker and investor. He didn't save me in the classic, cliché sense found in romance novels. He wasn't a knight on a white horse who came to solve my problems for me. No, I had handled my problems myself. Instead, he brought into my life something I never, under any circumstances, expected to receive from a man after Adrian's betrayal. Boundless, perceptive patience, absolute crystalline trust, and a quiet, reliable, deep friendship that over time gradually matured into a strong and seasoned feeling. Ethan was there when my agency went through a severe operational crisis during the pandemic. This billionaire, without a thought for his status, personally helped me rearrange tables, mount directional signs, and coordinate evacuation zones when half of my staff fell ill with high fevers and couldn't cope with the workload. During a horrific winter blizzard 3 years ago, when the high-voltage lines in my area snapped and the heating and electricity were completely cut off in my rented apartment, Ethan, despite the storm warning and massive snowdrifts, got behind the wheel of his massive SUV himself. He fought his way to me through the blizzard, brought powerful diesel heaters, thermoses of hot food, thermal underwear, and fluffy warm blankets, just to ensure I wouldn't freeze. He proved his reliability through actions every single day. His son Noah, whose biological mother had tragically died in a car accident when he was still an infant, became an essential, inseparable part of my soul. The boy grew up in a harsh, Spartan environment, surrounded by strict nannies and an perpetually busy father. When I first appeared in their home, he literally attached himself to my entire being. We read fairy tales together in the evenings, built gigantic Lego castles on the living room floor, and baked those very apple pies. 6 months ago, during a walk in a spring park, Noah happened to watch another family with a child, and suddenly, loudly across the entire path, called me Mom. I panicked at the time, knelt down in front of him, took his shoulders, and said softly, "Noah, sweetie, you can call me Diana. I'm your close friend. I'm right here." But the boy looked at me seriously, in a completely adult way with his huge gray eyes, and answered, "No, you are my mom, the one who is real, who is always with me." That day, I cried for a long time out of happiness in Ethan's office, and that word remained with us forever, because the child himself wanted it. And now, before the eyes of all the Academy alumni, this truth exposed itself in the most deafening, crushing manner. Former classmates, instantly forgetting the existence of Adrian and Giselle, began to surround Ethan and me in a dense, enthusiastic ring. People showered us with questions, genuinely admired Noah's athletic successes, extended their business cards to Ethan, and strained with all their might to express their respect to the financial titan. Adrian and Giselle were rudely, physically pushed to the absolute margins of this celebration of life by the crowd. Their fake authority, which they had spent 7 years constructing, popped in a single second like a cheap soap bubble. But the most terrifying, final blow to their shaky house of cards was delivered by Cheryl Benson. She had been watching this entire scene from the side with an icy smirk, and then, with a glass of champagne in hand, resolutely walked up to the pale, heavily breathing Adrian. Adrian, by the way, since we're talking about your grand, indispensable vice presidency and multi-million-dollar contracts that your wife was just shouting about across the hall, Cheryl said in a calm but incredibly clear, loud, and articulate voice that instantly carried across the hushed circle of guests. 6 months ago, I actually took over the regional audit department of your parent company. And just last week, some very interesting internal documents regarding your family construction firm passed across my desk. Heard the news? The Holdings Board of Directors has initiated a full, independent audit of all your personal contracts due to substantiated suspicions of grand embezzlement, forgery of documents, and siphoning funds into offshore accounts. And your father-in-law, Giselle's dad, seems to already be frantically searching for your replacement in the market to somehow save his business from a shameful bankruptcy and lawsuits. The expression on Adrian's face changed beyond recognition. It reflected the wild, primal, undisguised terror of a thief caught red-handed. His manicured skin was instantly covered in beads of cold sweat, the mask of a gentleman slid off completely, and his voice, when he attempted to answer, cracked into a hoarse, indistinct, hysterical shriek. "What? This is confidential corporate information. You have no right to speak about this here. This is a blatant lie and slander. Everything is wonderful at our company. We are market leaders." But it was already too late. The classmates around them began to exchange disgusted glances. A heavy, toxic whisper began to crawl through the hall. Everyone present understood the true essence of things in a fraction of a second. Their ideal marriage and luxurious life were not built on Adrian's talent at all, but on the money of Giselle's father, to which Adrian had simply sought the shortest and dirtiest path. And that path was now leading him straight to a criminal case, a loss of status, and a scandalous divorce. Giselle saw in Adrian a beautiful, expensive trophy that she had stolen from her best friend out of envy, while Adrian saw in her merely a convenient social elevator to wealth. And now that elevator was plummeting down into the shaft, its cable snapped. Ethan Brooks, having listened intently to Cheryl, tilted his head slightly, looked at the frantically gasping, bewildered Adrian, and asked across the room in a chilling, deep, even tone, "So it was because of these non-entities that you nearly broke your life 7 years ago, Diana? Because of a petty thief who steals money from his own father-in-law and his dim-witted, envious companion? They aren't worth a single one of your tears." I looked Adrian straight in the eyes. For 7 long, agonizing years in my thoughts, I had envisioned this day. I had formulated plans for an elaborate, loud revenge. I had wanted to scream, hurl accusations in their faces, see their tears, their public humiliation, and their pleas for forgiveness. But now, standing here, holding little Noah's hand firmly and feeling Ethan's reliable, warm shoulder, I suddenly realized an amazing, beautiful thing. I didn't care at all. All my years of hatred, all my deep-seated pain, all that massive, heavy emotional baggage I had dragged behind me through the years simply collapsed, crumbled into dust, and evaporated in a single second. I had outgrown this situation. "You were absolutely right back then, Adrian," I said quietly, yet strikingly clearly, and a dead, paralyzing silence fell over the ballroom. "Your escape from the wedding 7 years ago truly was the best, the most correct event, but only not in your life, but in mine. Because if you hadn't shown your true cowardice, rot, and weakness back then, I would never have known what real, sincere love is, what a man's loyalty means, and what a real, loving family feels like. I don't hold a single drop of hatred or malice toward you anymore. You received exactly the life you deserved. You deserve each other perfectly." At that exact moment, Giselle, whose face from shame and fury had turned as white as a burial shroud, made a frantic, chaotic movement backward, trying to hide from the glares of the crowd. Her hand, shaking with a heavy tremor, struck the tray of a server standing behind her. That very heavy crystal glass, filled to the brim with dark, thick red wine, flew to the floor with a deafening shatter. It smashed into pieces right at her feet, and the dark, blood-like liquid surged in all directions, instantly staining, soaking, and irrevocably destroying the hem of her flawless, dazzling white designer dress. Giselle shrieked in horror, flinched back, but the wine had already stained the expensive fabric permanently. She looked completely shattered, pathetic, soiled, and lost in the middle of this luxurious hall, before the eyes of everyone who had once considered her the queen of the class. It was the total collapse of her fake empire. About half an hour later, when the first wave of commotion in the hall had quieted down a bit, and the attention of most guests had shifted to the served gala dinner and new discussions, I decided to step out onto the open balcony of the hotel. I just needed to breathe the cool night air, compose myself, and be alone with my thoughts after everything that had occurred. I walked up to the wrought iron, ivy-twined railing of the balcony, looking out at the boundless lights of the night city. Suddenly, I heard a quiet, intermittent rustle to my right. There, in the furthest corner of the terrace, in the deep shadow of a column, stood Giselle. She leaned her back solitarily against the cold stone wall, crossing her arms over her chest. Her luxurious white dress was irrevocably ruined by a massive, ugly dark wine stain. The expensive mascara under her eyes had run heavily from tears, leaving black tracks on her cheeks, and she was frantically clutching a wet paper tissue in her hands. There was no longer a single drop of her former pride, arrogance, or venomous anger left on her face. She looked incredibly exhausted, broken, and aged by 10 years all at once. I froze in place, contemplating whether to quietly head back into the hall to avoid spoiling this perfect evening through an interaction with her. But I decided to stay. I had absolutely nothing left to fear in this life. Giselle noticed my presence. She slowly turned her head, looked at my calm, peaceful face, at my perfect sapphire dress, and said quietly, without her former toxicity or pretense, "You look truly happy, Diana. That isn't a fabricated mask, not a cheap picture. I can see it. I know you too well." I remained silent, just looking at her calmly and waiting to see what would come next. Giselle took a deep, shaky breath and suddenly began to speak, rapidly, confusingly, choking on her words, as if the dam of lies she had held inside herself for long years had finally burst. "You know, all these 7 years of our marriage have been a continuous, unceasing, quiet hell for me. I spent a colossal, just insane amount of emotional energy to create this perfect image of a successful couple before those around us, to prove to you, to your parents, and to everyone else that I had won, that I had claimed the best prize. But the truth is, Adrian began cheating on me just 6 months after our wedding. He lied to me just as masterfully, just as hypnotically and coldly as he once lied to you. He secretly became mired in massive debts. He constantly disappointed and set up my father, stole money from the company, and we had horrific, wild arguments with smashing dishes every single week. And the most terrifying, the most rotten part of it all? Diana, I thought of you every single time he caused me yet another ounce of pain or lied straight to my face. I sat in the bathroom, cried, and thought, this is my karma. This is my just return for what I so cynically did to Diana on her wedding day. She sniffled loudly and wiped her smudged mascara with the dirty tissue. I envied you so insanely, so desperately all these years, Diana, and believe me, not your business, your money, or your beautiful dresses. I envied your inner purity, your capacity to trust people, and your kindness, which I trampled upon. I was a complete fool. I thought that successful and handsome men were just expensive social trophies you could steal from a close friend and automatically become happy at her expense. But trophies don't know how to love, Diana. They are empty inside. Adrian has never in his life loved anyone besides his own ego. Forgive me, if you can ever bring yourself to do it. She looked at me with a timid, childish hope in her eyes, clearly expecting me to burst into tears, hug her back, or say that everything was fine and I forgave her. But I merely nodded my head to her silently, calmly, and deliberately. Some things in this life are impossible and simply dangerous to forgive or forget, and I was not about to lie to myself and to her for the sake of a beautiful cinematic scene. Her betrayal remained a betrayal forever, but that burden was no longer mine. It could simply be left in the past, like a long-read, heavy, and closed book to which you will never return. I turned around and walked back into the brightly lit ballroom where my real, honest life was waiting for me. Another long 6 months have passed. Right now, it is a beautiful, sun-drenched June of 2026. I am sitting on the simple wooden bleachers, warmed by the summer heat of a school stadium. I am wearing ordinary jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and sunglasses. In my hand, I grip a cool plastic cup of homemade lemonade and smile as I look at the green soccer field. There, among a dozen other squealing, relentless boys, dashes our Noah. There, he intercepts the ball from a towering opposing defender, executes a beautiful body feint, and sends the ball flying straight into the top corner of the net with a precise, powerful strike. The stadium instantly erupts with shouts and applause from the parents, and Noah whips around toward the bleachers, locates me with his huge eyes, and begins to wave his hand frantically with all his might, shouting across our entire section, "Mom! Mom, did you see? I scored! I did it!" Beside me on the bench sits Ethan. He smiles warmly, openly, takes my palm into his large, strong hand, and softly, securely intertwines our fingers. We were just quietly discussing our plans for the end of this summer. Last night, we made a definitive, conscious decision. We are completely, permanently abandoning the idea of holding a lavish, ostentatious, and loud wedding. No hundreds of vendors, no press, no massive banquet halls of five-star hotels, hundreds of semi-acquainted guests, and 4-tiered lavender cakes. All of that is merely external, empty tinsel behind which people so often and so desperately try to hide an inner vacuum and a lack of sincerity. Instead, we will arrange a small, very quiet, private, and cozy dinner right on the ocean shore. We will invite only my parents, a couple of our closest, time-tested friends, and of course Noah, who has already proudly declared himself the chief guardian of our wedding banns. Sitting here on these simple wooden bleachers, under the warm, gentle rays of the June sun, I have finally, definitively understood what the true, stripped of falsehood taste of life's success consists of. It does not lie at all in the carats of diamonds, nor in vice presidencies, nor in houses in exclusive gated communities, and certainly not in pathetic attempts to rub someone's nose in it at Academy alumni reunions. Success is found in the very simple, priceless, and tangible moments of our lives. It is a warm summer day. It is the ringing, happy laughter of a child who proudly calls you his mother, and it is the hand of a reliable, honest, and loving person who holds your palms so tightly that you know for certain he will never, under any circumstances, let it go. My story did not end on that nightmare of a freezing September morning in 2018 when I was betrayed and left alone at the altar. It had only just begun back then. Betrayal, lies, infidelity, and pain. This is not the finale of your book. It is merely one very dirty, heavy, dark, and unjust chapter that you simply need to find the strength within yourself to turn over. Because the happiest, brightest, purest, and most real pages of your life are always written only by you. This story is just one of many where justice prevails. If you want more spine-chilling dramas, subscribe to our channel and become part of the Storytime drama community. Leave a comment and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!